So in 2018, a new definition of trauma, a new disorder in fact, called complex trauma, was added to the ICD-11, I believe it was, one of the psychiatric profession's diagnostic manuals. It's become very widespread in addiction treatment centres, counselling centres, outpatient mental health practices, universities, schools, and in the popular imagination and in the press. I don't think it's real, and I think that the clinical practice that flows out of it, which is called trauma-informed care, is actually harmful. So I'm going to make my arguments here in this video. So the following quote would be a good example of this kind of concept creep around the word trauma, and a very good example of complex trauma, how it's used in real everyday life in actual institutions. If you go to the ICD-11, the definition is couched in much more professional terms, but if you read other university research departments and counselling centres' definition of complex trauma, you get a lot closer to how it's actually used. So this is a really good example of that, and it was issued by the Centre for Nonviolence and Social Justice at Drexel University. So right there you have a clue as to why it is so popular, right? And as I said, I've chosen it not because Drexel is remarkable in any way, but because it sort of precisely typifies the vague and inexact use of the word trauma that can be found in virtually any university campus, rehab or counselling centre today. So here's the quote. "The word trauma is used to describe experiences or situations that are emotionally painful and distressing, and that overwhelm people's ability to cope, leaving them powerless. Trauma has sometimes been defined in reference to circumstances that are outside the realm of normal human experience. Unfortunately, this definition doesn't always hold true. For some groups of people, trauma can occur frequently and become part of the common human experience. In addition to terrifying events such as violence and assault, we suggest that relatively more subtle and insidious forms of trauma, such as discrimination, racism, oppression, and poverty, are pervasive and, when experienced chronically, have a cumulative impact that can be fundamentally life-altering." So there you go. Obviously, it's worth saying from the outset that virtually nobody would agree that discrimination, racism, oppression and poverty are good things, right? So nobody's saying that. What I am questioning is the idea that medical disorders, health disorders, can be couched in such political terms. For me, this quote in particular makes it pretty obvious where this movement is really coming from. Okay, so now let's go down to the nub of it, which is language. So this is, the way I'd explain it is, categories of things are important, right? Words are important. So if you imagine, I mean, these days it's very popular for people to complain about over-medicating and over-diagnosing. And I've got a lot of sympathy with that view, obviously. I work in addiction treatment, so for me, for example, the insane levels of over-diagnosing of ADHD at the moment are at epidemic proportions. And that deserves its own video. I've done a number of videos talking about the over-diagnosing of trauma. Right, so I have great sympathy with this view that over-diagnosing is not a good thing. But look at it from the other angle. What if medical conditions weren't described adequately enough? What if the diagnosis was so inaccurate that you didn't know what you were dealing with, right? So imagine you've got something, you don't know what it is, it's a mysterious medical disorder, and you know what the human imagination does with that kind of thing. You're up all night on ChatGPT and so on. And then imagine that you go to the doctor and he or she tells you that you've got X, Y, or Z, right? So now you know what you've got. right? So even if it's serious, at least you know. Even if it's a big problem, it's now a problem that you understand, right? And that's helpful. So when a medical diagnosis is properly described and defined in this way, clinicians and patients can talk to each other about it because it has a face and a name, right? So without this kind of agreement on between clinicians and without the ability to communicate clearly with patients or clients, both the understanding and the treatment of a disorder can't advance in any meaningful way, right? So once you know that you're describing the same thing, you can observe its prevalence, you can study what causes it, you can experiment with different solutions and treatments. In short, you're comparing apples with apples, right? So PTSD, the classic definition of trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, is the perfect example of this kind of clarity, right? So if you read experts on the subject, real experts on the subject, like Dr. Michael Shearinger in New Orleans, who spent, 3 decades doing a lot of the groundbreaking research into PTSD, over 50 publications on the topic, scientific publications. He did a lot of work with youth PTSD in the wake of the New Orleans flooding. So according to Shearinger, PTSD is one of the most well-validated disorders in all of psychiatry. So if you read his book, They'll Never Be the Same, he explains how PTSD first became a distinct diagnosis in the 3rd edition of the DSM, which is another one of the psychiatric profession's diagnostic manuals. And that was published in 1980. And it was initially classed as an anxiety disorder, I believe. But it had pages and pages of full descriptions and a number of subtypes already. So do we really need a new subtype? For example, criteria A of that definition from DSM-3 was as follows, and this directly contradicts Drexel's brand new made-up definition. I quote, "The person has experienced an event that is outside the range of usual human experience and that would be markedly distressing to almost anyone, e.g. serious threat to one's life or physical integrity, serious threat or harm to one's children, spouse, or other close relatives and friends, sudden destruction of one's home or community, or seeing another person who has recently been or is being seriously injured or killed as the result of an accident or physical violence." So this is a very clear and precise description of the disorder, and that matters. This definition has become useful precisely because it's so exclusive, right? And what's more, there are real-life beneficiaries to that level of precision, right? Veterans being the obvious example. So veterans can now get financial benefits, whereas previously they could not. And although there's still a lot of ground to be made there, it's improved things for them massively since 1980. So on the one hand, a diagnosis can be restrictive and exclusive and possibly open to abuse via the sort of twin evils of over-diagnosing and over-medicating. And on the other hand, they can be very liberating precisely because they unleash this kind of collegiate power between professionals working together to provide precise treatments and improved quality of life for the sufferers of distinct illnesses, right? So it's been clear since the publication of DSM-3 that PTSD is a distinct disorder characterized by specific symptoms arising from unusually awful events that are outside the realm of normal human experience, right? But with the publication of further editions of DSM, they continued to resist the temptation to water down the trauma definition. DSM has remained faithful to that idea that I just explained, that these new versions of trauma that were starting to circulate were too wishy-washy. They muddied the waters, and so DSM-4 in 1994 and DSM-5 in 2013 still retained that classic definition of PTSD, that it centers around life-threatening events, or at the very least, something which involves serious threat to one's physical safety or that of a loved one, right? So, for example, according to Scheringer, the events that would be most likely to cause PTSD are not simply very stressful events. They are moments of terror that come upon the individual suddenly and unexpectedly, right? But clinicians from working from what I suppose you'd call a more social justice orientated perspective do not agree with that, never have agreed with that definition of trauma. They've been trying to water it down since the 1990s, and they are now having quite a lot of success, and they are winning hearts and minds, most especially in the public. So these people I would call collectively trauma lobbyists or trauma evangelists, and we can ask a number of questions about why doing that, why spending your entire career doing that would be a worthy thing. Well, I'd suggest, as I have done before, that there are a number of motivations, and none of them, in my view, are anything to do with the well-being of patients and clients who have mental health problems. In the final analysis, I'm not saying that anybody is specifically motivated to do any kind of harm. Of course they're not. That's extremely unlikely. They probably tell themselves that this is the right thing to do. But I believe deep down it's motivated more by prestige, academic prestige, potentially increasing the amount of things that you can pathologize and thereby charge money for, write books about, do conferences on. It's sort of stimulating an industry where it doesn't really need to exist. And authors like Tana Deneen, I think that's the right pronunciation of her word, she's a very well-known psychologist who handed in her license in the 1990s out of sheer disgust for this industry that manufactures victims, and that was the name of her book. I mean, talk about being ahead of your time. She was decades ahead of the rest of us in calling this out. So if we drill down and look for evidence of Drexel's claim that the accepted medical definition of trauma doesn't always hold true, what we're going to find is a brand new, I still say pretty unsubstantiated, but incredibly popular definition of trauma that's being driven hard by lobby groups within the mental health profession. And this new definition is known as complex trauma. It's previously known as interpersonal trauma, developmental trauma, but it ended up being more widely known as complex trauma. And it's been floating around since the 1990s. As I said, it finally made its way into one of the reputable classification systems in 2018, which is a big mistake in my view and a lot of people's views. It had been rejected time and time again by the DSM because it wasn't rigorous enough. It started in '92 with a psychiatrist called Judith Harmon, who wrote a paper that first conceptualized complex PTSD and suggested it for inclusion into the DSM as a separate disorder from normal PTSD. Her main argument was that the existing definition of PTSD failed to take into account the fact that many people, children who've been abused and so on, experience repeated traumas, and that the repetitive nature of these traumas produce unique symptoms that were not covered by the existing definition of PTSD. So, for example, in 1994, DSM-4 was due for publication, and the developers of that manual decided to test Harmon's hypothetical disorder for possible inclusion. And what they found was that out of 118 adults who qualified for the new definition of complex trauma, 113 of them were picked up quite adequately by the existing diagnostic tests, e.g. PTSD tests. So the new definition was not necessary. And obviously, most victims of child abuse would be covered by that original definition of PTSD because it's so outside the realm of ordinary human experience and would be markedly distressing to almost anyone. Those were that's the wording of the PTSD definition. So it didn't get in, but that wasn't the end of it. Other psychiatrists who are very well known in the popular world, like Bessel van der Kolk, who I've mentioned before, whose 2015 book, The Body Keeps the Score, hit the New York Times bestseller list for what, 7 years? So he has been very up front and center of pushing developmental trauma, interpersonal trauma, or what became complex trauma as well. And he also had a run at getting it pushed into the DSM. In his own words, the new definition of trauma, the reason we needed a new definition of trauma was because it needed to include things like maltreatment, neglect, separation from a caregiver, and emotional abuse. Well, if you see my video on adverse childhood experiences study, these are adverse childhood experiences. They're not traumas. A lot of people would think that they're the same thing. They're not, as psychiatrists like Michael Shearinger will explain. They might be terrible, and they might be cumulative, and they might be inescapably stressful, but things like emotional abuse could be something like your single parent refusing to talk to you more or less all the time. Now that's a really horrible situation to be in as a child growing up, but it's not terrifying and it doesn't make you think you're going to die imminently. So it wouldn't cause the same kind of neurological mangling that PTSD, shell shock, shock trauma, being bombed in a muddy ditch for 10 days, it doesn't do the same types of things to your brain that those things do. Right, so they're not traumas, really, is what most traditional psychiatrists would say, and I would agree with them. So they're stressful and unfortunate, but they are not trauma in the psychiatric sense of the word, because they do not usually involve actual or threatened death or serious injury, right? But nevertheless, van der Kolk and others have lobbied hard for developmental trauma, or now complex trauma's inclusion in the psychiatric classification systems, and eventually they turned out to be successful. The reason they were unsuccessful initially is because their claims were largely unsubstantiated. But what they did do is they engaged in a really big PR campaign mounted, especially by van der Kolk, I mean, intentionally or otherwise. His book was very, very successful, obviously, and it got the message across very successfully. And it seemed that the appetite for these ideas among the public, as apparent in the success of van der Kolk's book, is very high. So it's fertile ground out there for this kind of upselling of our fragility. So today, these new definitions of trauma have managed to sort of crowbar their way into the psychiatric profession, I would argue. And you've got, for example, Michael Shearinger is one of the few remaining stalwarts that argues against this. I do also, but I mean, there's a really interesting quote here from Michael Shearinger. He says, "When I give lectures or trainings, like these days, audience members almost invariably state that they believe neglect, living with a mother who abuses drugs, and being separated from one's parents and placed in foster care easily qualify as traumatic events, and have examples from their work to prove it. When we walk through their examples, however, it becomes clear that they have failed to separate discrete traumatic events from the larger stressful events." So it may seem to people today really crazy to say that being brought up in care, in foster care or something, is not a trauma. That's because the word trauma has become used so imprecisely that people no longer understand what it means. That experience is obviously potentially dreadful, although there are people who I know who've been through foster care who've become extremely functional adults, right? That is much more rare when you've been caught down the end of a dead-end street in a broken down city in a war zone and been besieged for a month and seen everyone around you die. Your chances of being well later are much lower than if you were brought up in foster care. Or another way of saying it is, the amount of people who remain functional, who had difficult childhoods, is quite high. What they have suffered is not a trauma, it's an adversity, and there's a discrete difference between those things. So why is this important? Why? This is not mere semantics, I'm going to argue. It's important because medical language is important and categories of things are important because, one, watering down or widening medical diagnoses to satisfy what I think are political goals or personal career ambitions is a bad precedent to set. Where does it end? Two, there'll be losers. People who are suffering from legitimate PTSD will obviously have to share resources and sympathy with people who, frankly speaking, don't deserve them. Three, inclusion of non-traumatic events into the diagnosis of trauma makes a mockery of those individuals in many cases when the thing that's being offered up as trauma is trivial. It makes a mockery of those who've suffered real traumas, obviously. And from my own field, my own perspective in particular, I would say with regard to addiction in particular and addiction treatment and positing trauma as a major cause of addiction, rather than a possible coexisting condition, or even the end result of addiction itself, so the trauma comes from the addiction. The problem with getting that the wrong way round is that addicts, often active addicts or addicts in treatment and recovery, often they get treated for their actual, they don't get treated, I should say, for their actual addiction because the emphasis is placed on trauma as the primary problem rather than the other way around. And this is absolutely rife and endemic amongst addiction treatment professionals today. They're really, really out of control. And almost everybody is beginning to believe it now, that the trauma is the main problem and the addiction is really just this thing that happens because of the trauma. So they go in and treat the trauma. And the problem with that is it frequently, if not always, leads to a papering over of the crucial foundations for addiction recovery, like acknowledging and assuming personal responsibility and accountability for one's actions, right? So personally, I think the situation's probably even more concerning than somebody like Scheringer would make out, right? I'm really quite concerned about it. And I mean, to me, this is a sea change, not just in psychology, is seeping out into society and fragilizing everybody. That's a made-up word, by the way. That's my word. Making fragile. It's making a lot of people fragile and therefore more mentally unwell, right? So it's actually harming people. And to be fair, it's straight out of the postmodernist playbook, right? Where you disorder categories of things and dissemble things and break things down. Sometimes, well, in the case of the postmodernists, I would say purely for the hell of it. And whilst I'm sure that's not the case in terms of the medical professionals that are involved in this trauma revolution, there are much more mixed. They will have, of course, good motives, I believe. I think the harm that they're causing is unintentional, although they may be conflicted. But behind that, I think, lies quite a devilish trend in modern Western society, that of postmodernism and the way that it's morphed into ultra-progressive politics, right? So how's about this? How's about we look at how much trauma actually exists, particularly in the realm of addiction, right? So we know that because there's some papers on it. So when it comes to looking for the actual amount of post-traumatic stress disorder, so you might argue the more serious level of trauma that exists in chronic drug users, or how much do they actually suffer from this, we find it's only a minority who have it. And further, rates of PTSD amongst addicts are somewhat lower than other mental health disorders, right? So in one study quoted by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, which is the main body in the US overseeing mental health services, those researchers looked at the prevalence of psychiatric disorders in a sample of chronic crack cocaine users in poor communities. And while 24% had psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, and around 18% had depression, only 11.8% had PTSD. Most of the other studies referenced by SAMHSA had similar results, and rates of PTSD were never above 40–50%. Interestingly, these researchers also found that white drug users experience more of these co-occurring psychiatric disorders than black drug users did. So that suggests something contrary to the pair of ACEs model, which is the most radical childhood trauma model, which saw, and indeed Drexel University's claim that racism and other forms of oppression are the main driver of things like addiction. So it looks like something else is going on. What could that be? Another study quoted by SAMHSA looked at Brazilian crack cocaine users and found that a considerable amount of their trauma was picked up on the street, really, by way of the extreme violence and degradation that their drug-using activities exposed them to. Obviously, right? It's pretty obvious if you think about it. But these are just inconvenient facts to the progressive wing of psychology, right? So, but it's immediately obvious to anybody who spent any amount of time dealing with real street addicts and injecting drug users, as I have, many other people have, that most of the trauma that they have results from their activities as drug users, not even from their upbringing in a children's home or something, where while some will have terrible experiences, others will have just long-term stress, but it won't necessarily be at a traumatic level, and they get out of there and they lead functional lives. But at the point where you hit the street, Skid Row, tent cities, and start injecting drugs and you're out of your mind all the time, then the likelihood of serious traumas befalling you is much higher, right? Okay, so now we get on to talk about this thing called trauma-informed care. So due to this mysterious epidemic of trauma that suddenly descended on our culture out of nowhere, occasioning vast amounts of substance abuse, overeating, death by chronic disease, and so on, the psychology profession has invented us a remedy, and that remedy is called trauma-informed care, TIC for short. So TIC is not a fringe philosophy on the margins of mental health anymore. It is taking over the mental health profession, I would say. So according to SAMHSA, out of 10,000 behavioral healthcare programs surveyed across the US, the majority now provide TIC of some kind. And it's interesting in passing to note SAMHSA's definition of trauma as well from when it was first publishing protocols on trauma-informed care way back in 2014. So their definition of trauma that helped frame trauma-informed care was as follows: an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as harmful. So you can see once again, this is a subjective definition of trauma. This is essentially what complex trauma is about. Painful events are open to interpretation on the part of the sufferer. So something can be traumatic if it merely makes you feel bad, essentially. The divorce of parents or other fairly common adversities could easily be included in this definition of trauma if they were experienced as harmful, and indeed much more trivial things, indeed. But it doesn't, these things do not expose you to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So this is a fragility model of mental health, really, that's coming to the fore, I would argue. In fact, oh yes, here it is. According to Drexel, back to Drexel, they note that psychological trauma is not limited to the original PTSD criteria, that it could be characterized more broadly. We've already seen them say that. But that it could instead be defined as a sudden or forceful event that overwhelms your capacity to respond to it, and that it need not involve actual physical harm to yourself. On the contrary, something could even be traumatic if it contradicts one's worldview, which I thought was really Orwellian and difficult to sympathize with. So this is pretty familiar territory that activists do when they're working in mental health care. They start by diluting a definition, in this case trauma, from the medical standard. Then they assert that it's not the event itself that defines trauma, but rather your subjective interpretation of that event and the power of your emotional response to it. But if you think about it, by this criteria, I don't know, a toddler who's told he can't watch TV anymore and has to go to bed, and whose emotional resources are overwhelmed by the request, resulting in him having a tantrum every day for several weeks, that could be trauma, right? It's ridiculous. Another institution, Buffalo Center of Social Research at Buffalo University, according to them, trauma-informed care, so this is the methodology that's used to treat trauma. Once you've been diagnosed with complex trauma, this is the type of modalities and treatments that you should receive. So according to Buffalo, trauma-informed care is, I quote, an approach in the human service field that assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have a history of trauma, and which understands and considers the pervasive nature of trauma and promotes environments of healing and recovery rather than practices and services that may inadvertently re-traumatize. So this definition centers around two things. First, the sort of central article of faith in the ACE trauma model, which says trauma is pervasive. It's not. Second, or it is in the sense that they mean it's in the watered down, terribly watered down sense, then yes, it's pervasive because they're normal everyday experiences, so of course they're pervasive. As for its solutions, well, TIC, trauma-informed care, is mostly a system of do's and don'ts, and mostly don'ts, right? So these are the taboos, if you like, which in and of themselves are assumed to promote wellness as long as they are not breached. Right, so like any good secular religion, they have a system of taboos. So the entire sort of theory behind TIC really is that mental health problems derive from things that external entities do to you, right? So thus, it stands to reason that if these things cease to exist or cease to happen, then our inherent sanity will return, right? So one of these taboos is re-traumatization. Re-traumatization is kind of a taboo, but it's also like a therapeutic tool. The avoidance of it is in itself, the avoidance of the breach of the taboo is therapeutic, right? So the golden rule is don't do anything that might re-traumatize an addicted or mentally unwell person, and then everything will be okay. But the problem with that is that what constitutes re-traumatization, according to them, can be almost anything, right? So the Institute on Trauma and Trauma-Informed Care, also at Buffalo, provides a number of rather asinine examples of these taboos, as I will outline. My video editing skills are not at the level of putting graphics up yet, so I'm going to have to talk you through this. So this is a graphic, clinical practices that are likely to re-traumatize. At the top, it has the title Re-traumatization with a picture of a broken heart next to it. And then underneath it, the subtitle, the caption is What Hurts? ? question mark. And then there's a list of things that hurt or re-traumatize as follows. Having to continually retell your story. This is if you're in mental health services or addiction treatment. Being treated as a number. Procedures that require disrobing. But I hope you're not going for surgery then. Being seen as their label, e.g. addict, schizophrenic. I've done another video on why labeling yourself addict is insanely mentally healthy. No choice in service or treatment. No opportunity to give feedback about their experience with service delivery. So these things might be annoying, but are they traumatizing? Surely not. And secondly, why would having to continually retell your story or be labeled an addict re-traumatize you when the science and the combined experience of millions of people in recovery in AA and NA says the precise opposite, right? Anyway, so to go deeper and into the realms of the truly ridiculous, now we will discuss trauma champions, which is an actual thing, right? So because trauma-informed care is an ideology, it requires proselytizers, right? It needs people to expand and uphold it. And in the lingo of this sort of neo-Freudian psychology religion, these proselytizers are known as trauma champions. They're actually a thing. So according to Harris and Fallot, who are two academics who were primary architects of the trauma-informed care model, a champion understands the impact of violence and victimization on the lives of people seeking mental health or addiction services, and is a frontline worker who thinks trauma first. When trying to understand a person's behavior, the champion will ask, is this related to abuse and violence? So you know what they say, to a boy with a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? They go on. A champion will also think about whether his or her own behavior is hurtful or insensitive to the needs of a trauma survivor. A champion is there to shine the spotlight on trauma issues. Well, that's for sure. Yeah, the real question is why. So people seeking mental health and addiction services are oppressed victims, right? Counselors, social workers and psychologists working within the TIC model are champions, right? This is the language of benefactors and beneficiaries, right? Of saviors and the saved. It's a medieval fairy tale of gallant knights rescuing damsels in distress. Only in this case, the damsels are people with addiction and mental health issues. Nevertheless, I'm going to suggest that trauma-informed care is not something that we can really laugh about. It's a sea change in the working culture of mental health and quite possibly in society. It's got significant resources behind it. It's got its tentacles wrapped firmly around government funding, policy bodies like SAMHSA. So for example, as this stuff started to pick up speed in the 2010s, SAMHSA started issuing directives, right, such as this, from their treatment improvement protocols paper in 2014, so that's how far back this was getting moving. They said there, this culture of care, trauma-informed care, must permeate the organisation from top to bottom. And an organisational culture of care, safety and respect demands activities that foster the development of trauma-informed counsellors. So this is the way things are headed. In fact, it's the way things are now. This is now the establishment. The pathologizing of normal everyday stressors is now the foundation stone on which mental health treatment and possibly even the very conception of mental health is being built. So perhaps the worst thing, in my view, about all of this supposedly compassionate, ACE-aware, trauma-informed approach to mental health is what I call therapeutic absolution, right? The kind of effortless, or possibly you'd say uneffortful compassion, one that requires no skin in the game at all. It's unhelpful to addicts who are trying to turn their lives around and who have almost always cause considerable amounts of turmoil in their own lives, as well as those of their partners, parents, children, communities. But this social justice model, really, which is what it is telling them it's society that must change, not you, right? So that is selling us short, right? It's something that you would never hear in addiction recovery circles and movements such as AA, where peers hold each other to a much higher standard, nor indeed is it something that you would ever hear a loving parent say to their addicted son or daughter. It's essentially a luxury belief that you can afford to hold on someone else's behalf, but that you wouldn't follow yourself. Right, so this is bringing in what I call enforced fragility, right? So it's institutionalizing fragility, and it's coming to a workplace near you. So even though this stuff is mostly from the mid-2010s, it's now starting to actualize, I would say. So SAMHSA again identified several priorities for organizations with regard to recruiting and hiring trauma-informed staff, and so you can see where that's going. So for example, they suggested active recruitment of and outreach to prospective employees who are trauma-informed or who have formal education in providing trauma-informed or trauma-specific services in settings such as universities, professional organizations, professional training and conference sites, peer support groups, and consumer advocacy groups. And even more worryingly, all of those services are advised to provide the following: incentives, bonuses, and promotions for staff members during recruitment and hiring that take into consideration prospective employees' trauma-related education, training, and job responsibilities. So in other words, professionals with a fully paid up commitment to the philosophy of pathologizing everyday experiences will now be incentivized and promoted to greater positions of power and financially remunerated to a greater degree than clinicians who do not subscribe to that philosophy, right? So according to Fallis and Harrett, again, a fully trauma-informed workplace would adhere to the following directives. 1. Ensuring administrative commitment to integrating trauma-informed culture. 2. Providing introductory training to all staff. 3. Establishing an internal trauma team. 4. Including providers and providees in planning and evaluation of services. 5. Addressing any potential re-traumatizing policies or procedures. And 6. Conducting early and respectful trauma screening and assessment for all. So get the net out and bring them in. This all sounds harmless, really, until you get into what it actually means, at which point it becomes rather Orwellian, right? So the fragility model promoted by ACE Aware movement, the cult of trauma as I call it, is not only being encouraged here, it's kind of being enforced, right? And if, like the majority of the population, you're sort of currently unmoved by this semantic shift in trauma definitions, because it doesn't really affect you that much, then let me translate the gobbledygook and explain where I think it could be headed. So I'm going to go back through those and give my read on them. So the first one, ensuring administrative commitment to integrating a trauma-informed culture. My read on that is as follows. Make sure that all workplaces, and via legislation this could one day include private businesses, make sure that they are controlled by a legally empowered HR department which spearheads the ideology of fragility in the workplace and promotes the agenda of wildly overdiagnosing people with trauma, including staff, customers and service users, with a view to then exempting them from anything that might re-traumatize them, like doing some work. 2. Provide introductory training to all staff. Read for that. Enforce the indoctrination of unscientific definitions of trauma in those who have heretofore avoided such indoctrination, right? So it's an enforcement. 3. Establish an internal trauma team, which sounds kind of worrying. My read on that is put social workers or counsellors in as many workplaces as possible, and again that might possibly include your private business, who will function as a kind of social justice police force, right? Not only will these professionals proliferate the fragility model of mental health, which will no doubt lead to more sickness amongst traumatized colleagues and you having to pick up the slack for them. But you'd also better hope to God that you never fall out with any of these fragile but empowered colleagues, because if you do, you can bet that the internal trauma team are not going to be on your side, right? They're going to be champions. 4, include providers and providees in planning and evaluation of services. Read for that. Form channels by which disgruntled and often mentally unstable staff, customers and service users can make unreasonable demands and unsubstantiated damaging complaints against you under the subterfuge of you having re-traumatized them. 5, address potential re-traumatizing policies. We'll read that this way: remove anything from the business or service which might hurt people's feelings. This can be almost anything because it's being subjectively defined by the person themselves. Get ready to be the punch bag of any random crazy that feels like taking out their issues on you or your business, and get ready to kowtow whenever they invoke the holy taboo of re-traumatization. Right? 6, conduct early and respectful trauma screening. Screen everybody you possibly can for trauma with the express aim of expanding the number of individuals who have it. And it's especially important to target disadvantaged groups and then persuade them that they're traumatized victims and that the only way out of their predicament is to blame their environment, e.g. others. And when they're recruited like this in sufficient numbers, they will then form a powerful body politic that you can use in some way, right? So, am I paranoid? I hope so. I'd say it depends currently on the workplace you're in. But if you're in the public sector, I would say you're in a much more danger of being on the receiving end of that stuff. And who knows, maybe one day it makes its way into private business. Either way, I see trauma-informed care as largely causing more harm than good, and that inevitably follows from the fact that it comes from a disorder, a medical disorder that was made up, mostly because of the conflicted interests of its promoters.